Octavia and James, our 6 and 7-year-old children, were waiting outside for the school bus the other day. It was one of the last days of school, but it resembled a lot of the others. You see, they were arguing to decide which of them would get on the bus first. These moments of conflict provide us parents the opportunity to underscore some of the lessons we try to teach them. I called James over and bent down to have a conversation with him, reminding him how important it is to do kind things for others. I even suggested he might consider what Jesus would do if Jesus and his brother or sister were waiting for the bus. And James quickly responded, "I get it, Dad." And he told me that Jesus definitely would let his brother or sister get on the bus before him. And without missing a beat, he looked to me and said, "Dad, I think it's Octavia's turn to be Jesus." You laugh. But there is metaphorical truth in that parable too. So many of us want everyone else in our lives to be like Jesus, but we struggle each day to do what we know we can to discipline ourselves to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Jesus' first disciples struggled too, and he often told them stories to help them understand what they were failing to see in his life and his example right before their eyes. The parable we heard a few moments ago demonstrates once again how hard it is to follow in Jesus' footsteps, and it shows that the Good Samaritans are indeed big shoes for us to fill. We who are gathered here in worship today or tuned in on the stream at home might like to think that we're always the Good Samaritan in the stories of our lives. We like to think that we'd go out of our way and slow down on our own walk to lift someone else up. We can't imagine ourselves as the robber in the story. And granted, we never choose to steal from someone or to abuse or hurt them intentionally. If we're honest, though, there have likely been times when we have hurt people and made them feel abandoned and alone and pushed over to the side of the road. We don't want to think we'd walk by like the priest, though we ourselves have gotten so busy and preoccupied with our own convictions and beliefs or the business of our life or our church that we've failed to actually minister to people who need us the most. We don't want to think we'd walk by like the Levite, though there likely have been times we've turned our back to someone who thinks differently than we do, who looks differently than we do, who votes differently than we do. Though we desire to be the Good Samaritan, there have been times we've turned our head away from a stranger's pain and looked to the other side of the road. There have been times we've driven through a rough neighborhood and rolled up our windows of our fancy cars and locked our doors and drove right by. We've enclosed our front porches or put them in the back of our house. We've fenced in our yards and we've installed our security systems, and some of us have even gated our communities. Though we wish it were not so, there may have also been times we feel like the unidentified person lying on the side of the road. Times when the world seems to have ignored or mistreated us. Times when we feel unseen or abandoned or forgotten. As we remember the story today, we can ponder together, who is Jesus in the story, in the parable? We might first think of Jesus as the one who comes to save the stranger, the one who goes to the margins, the one who goes to the side of the road to help someone in need, the one who brings healing and compassion. And that's a good thought, because surely the Jesus we know from the Scriptures lives up to those expectations and more. Jesus showed us that 99 sheep are not enough, that we are all loved. Jesus is the parent who welcomes the prodigal home with open arms and an extravagant feast, whether the child deserves it or not. Jesus would offer the hospitality and care and love that the Samaritan did, surely. Did you notice in the story that the Samaritan did not call a doctor and go on? He bandaged the stranger's wounds and treated them himself. He did not call an Uber or a cab to pick him up. He put him on his own donkey. He himself took him to the inn. And he didn't drop him off at a shelter or a center to turn over the responsibility of his care to an institution. No, he took him to the inn, and he told the innkeeper, "If you need anything more, I'll be back." And he came back the next day, and he promised to come back again and again and again. Just think how hard that would have been to come back again and again and again in those days. Imagine taking that good a care of a stranger, of a neighbor who you didn't even know. But I'd like to ask us to ponder, perhaps, that Jesus could be the one lying on the side of the road. After all, when Jesus was born, nobody helped him and his family find a room in the inn, let alone pay for it or check on him the day after that or the day after that. In fact, there was already a king in pursuit to try to harm the child. And Jesus knew as he was teaching this parable that he would soon be denied and betrayed and stripped and beaten and crucified. He knew that when he would need them the most, his closest friends would see his suffering and they would walk right by and turn their heads and go on the other side of the road. Whether Jesus is the Good Samaritan or the unknown one suffering on the side of the road ultimately may not really matter. What really matters is that we stop trying to justify our selfishness and sinfulness with questions like the lawyers. Who's my neighbor? The story encourages us to start living a life that asks a decidedly different question. Please, won't you be my neighbor? Many of us were asked that question every day. For me, it was at 5 o'clock, Monday through Friday on WVIZ Cleveland. Ordained Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Fred McFeely Rogers, followed the inspiration of St. Francis, who said, "Preach the gospel at all times, but use words only when absolutely necessary." Mr. Rogers preached with puppets instead of in pulpits, and he taught us songs about love instead of hymns about theology. He wore zip-up cardigans instead of button-up vestments. His parables took place in the neighborhood of make-believe, but they taught us deeply important lessons of faith that matter in our real lives. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Mr. Rogers longed for every child to know that there was at least one other person in that moment who cared for them and who wanted to be with them. And sadly, but also fortunately, I suppose, There were so many children who desperately needed to have someone tell them that. Children who were otherwise, in a metaphorical sense at least, just lying by the side of the Jericho road. Mr. Rogers was not on television so children would see him. He was on TV so children would know that someone saw them. He believed that the space between the television set and the child could become holy ground. Almost not a day went by that he would not remind us, there is no one else in the whole world just like you. There never has been, and there never will be. You are special just the way you are. As I like to say, God loves you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. You are born to live and to love in a way that no one else ever has, and that no one else ever could. So God created human beings in God's own image. In the image of God, we all are created. Everyone is made in the image of God, and for that reason alone, they should be valued and appreciated. And if each of us is special just the way we are, that means our neighbor is also special just the way they are. And we should all value and appreciate each other. We should love one another. Mr. Rogers said, love isn't a state of perfect caring. It's an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is, right here and now. One of the songs I remember from the neighborhood is one I'd like to sing, and I'd invite you to sing it with me if you remember it too. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. It's not the things that hide you. It's not your toys. They're just beside you. But it's you I like. Every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you'll remember, even when you're blue, that it's you I like. It's you yourself. It's you. It's you I like. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. He couldn't say that on public television, but in all kinds of ways, he showed us the rest. Love your neighbor as yourself. An interviewer asked him once, as the lawyer asked Jesus, "Who is your neighbor?" The person you happen to be with at the moment, especially if that person is in need. To see people who will notice a need in the world, he says, and do something about it, and rather than view it with despair, they view it with hope. That, to me, is such an enormous gift in this life. Those are my heroes. There are so many people who say, it's not my kid, it's not my school, it's not my community, forget about it. But there are others who say, it is my kid, it is my school, it is my neighbor. When we live a life following Jesus, the question, who is my neighbor, becomes quite irrelevant, doesn't it? The question always is, won't you be my neighbor? In the first episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in 1968, King Friday the 13th had demanded that a wall be built around his castle. You see, the neighborhood was changing. New people were moving in, and he wanted to keep things safe the way they always were. There was no way of telling what those new neighbors might do to change the kingdom, after all. And Fred's brave, courageous, spiritual voice spoke through an imaginary king in a make-believe castle, revealing the foolish things we were doing in our suburban kingdoms, in our world. What walls are we building right now that keep us from noticing the people lying on the side of the road? Who's our neighbor? That same season, on a hot summer day in the neighborhood, Mr. Rogers invited his friend, the opera-singing police officer, Francois Clemens, to take a break from the heat and to join him, dipping his feet in this little kiddie pool he had set up in the front yard. Fred even washed his neighbor's feet that day. It's important to remember as you picture this scene that Mr. Rogers was white and that Officer Clemens was black. Think how radical this might have been. May 1969 was just months after Martin Luther King's assassination. And in those days, in many areas of our country, blacks were not welcome in many white swimming pools. How did we ever let that happen? People were pouring gasoline in swimming pools and lighting them on fire. And a lot of us just walked right by and looked to the other side of the road. Who's our neighbor? 25 years later, we still hadn't learned our lesson, so Mr. Rogers and Officer Clemens reenacted the same scene in the same way in 1993. And my friends, now, since then, 30 more years have passed, and Mr. Rogers is no longer here to do the work of the gospel for us. It's our turn to get in the pool ourselves. We still haven't learned the lesson he was trying to teach us, a lesson that Jesus had tried to teach us nearly 2,000 years before that. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of your neighbors, you did not do for me. Yet, somehow we keep walking by and looking on the other side of the road. You've probably seen the memes and the t-shirts and the billboards. Love your neighbor, your black neighbor, your Latino neighbor, your Asian neighbor, your gay neighbor, your transgender neighbor, your homeless neighbor, your Muslim neighbor, your Jewish neighbor. The list can go on. I sometimes need to remind myself of some neighbors I need to personally try harder to love. Maybe you have some too. I need to try harder to love my socially conservative neighbor. I need to try harder to love my evangelical neighbor. I need to try harder to love my mentally ill neighbor. I need to try harder to love my abusive neighbor. May God help me that I would not leave any of those neighbors by the side of the road. Mr. Rogers was once asked, if you had one final broadcast, one final opportunity to address your television neighbors, and you could tell them the single most important lesson of your life, what would you say? Well, I would want those who were listening to know that they had unique value, that there isn't anybody in the whole world exactly like them, and that there never has been, and there never will be, and that they are loved by the one who created them in a unique way. If they could know that and really know it and have that behind their eyes, they could look with those eyes on their neighbor and realize, my neighbor has unique value too. There's never been anybody in the whole world like my neighbor, and there never will be. If they could value that one person, if they could love that person in ways that we know the eternal loves us, then I would be very grateful. Who's our neighbor? When we follow Jesus, we know that's a question we never have to ask. When we follow Jesus, there's another question we have to be asking again and again and again and again. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Amen.